EPGE and FGV to start the second day of this Vale sponsor meeting in business cycle. For this special occasion, nobody could be more appropriate than Professor Christoph Sims, the winner of Nobel Prize in Economics. His main scientific contributions are in macroeconomic theory and econometrics, as well as its policy implication. He was a pioneer in the use of structural vector autoregressive models, and that led to a revolution in the evaluation of economic policy, such as monetary policy. He used as well Bayesian methods in his analysis. This theory led to ways of estimating dynamic stochastic general equilibrium that are widespread use in the world today. He also one of the main contributors of the fiscal theory of the price level, which connect fiscal policy, fiscal background, to monetary policy and to the price level. More recently, he has been working on rational inattention. That's a simple way to model bounded rationality and a practical way. In a more personal tone, I met Chris Sims many years ago. He was always a support of Econometric Society meetings. He came to several of these meetings. His students contributed to this formation of this group. And he has been in Brazil a couple of times. I remember last time, I think was 2009, I think. And then when we organized EPGE, Fundação Getúlio Vargas, NIMPA, organized the Economic Society and La Salle meeting. And he participated in a very interesting panel analyzing the balance sheet of the Fed. Also has many students. I cannot remember all of them, but at least he doesn't. I asked him, even the Brazilians won, or the Latin American, then I should close to the Brazil, but then so many that. But at least one special that's in our house here is Thiago Beriel, that's a professor here, a young macroeconomist here in EPGE. And I'm very thankful for him to just helping us also producing this student. So I don't want to take any more of this time, so I ask Professor Sims to start his lecture. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction. Thanks to Vale and all the people who helped organize this conference. It's been very interesting, and Rio's been a very pleasant place to visit. So I'm going to be talking about using financial data in macroeconomic models. This is a high priority. We have not been using financial data in macroeconomic models, at least in the ones that were being used in policy making before this recent crisis. It's not that nobody ever looked at them at financial variables. No macroeconomists ever looked at financial variables. It's just that it wasn't clear to people that they were important. So the policy models didn't incorporate them. I should also say that I'll show you some results, but not all the results that I would like to will eventually have. And this is joint work with Marcus Brunnermeier and Darius Palia. And since the results I have actually didn't appear until last night around 10 p.m., they haven't seen them yet and are not responsible. So you can't blame them for errors. Now, macroeconometricians have had success in modeling normal times monetary policy. In fact, you can argue that the success we had there may have set the stage for the crisis by convincing people that volatility had disappeared. We had a list of variables that everybody was playing around with. Interest rates, usually a short interest rate, some kind of money stock variable, a price variable, some measure of business activity, output, or industrial production. Money kept giving us a problem because its definition kept having to shift around, but the others were pretty standard. It didn't really matter much which measure of Y you used. You could use industrial production and monthly data. And it turned out that we could identify the effects of monetary policy plausibly with structural VARs, that is, with an approach which used very limited a priori restrictions in order to try to pull out the disturbances to the economy that originated in disturbances to monetary policy. This was possible because we were looking for the effects of a one-dimensional policy, monetary tightening or easing, and it turned out that that different approaches to trying to pull out this component of the disturbances to the economy gave similar answers. So the initial approaches, the ones that I used at first and most of the time in my research, were based on delays. That is, on assuming that a monetary policy action did not immediately impact output or price changes. But it turned out there were other ways of doing the identification. You could instead say, I know what the response of the economy is to a monetary policy tightening, and use that information to identify a monetary policy disturbance, and you got very similar answers. And these same methods worked in different periods of time and in different countries and gave similar results. And then also we were working with what we now realize were unusually stable times. I call them normal times, but it's not so clear that they're normal now that we've had this recent crisis. And the economy, the US economy and most advanced economies were fluctuating in a narrow range. There weren't episodes. We had an episode of high inflation. We went up to 10% or so. That's by most economy standards not really high. And output fluctuated in a relatively narrow range over the whole period from about 1950 to the recent crisis. So nonlinearities in these models were relatively unimportant, and that was very helpful in our modeling task. Now we're trying to bring financial variables into the system. We don't have a standard list of variables. In fact, the reason we don't have a standard list of variables is, I think, endogenous, that a financial crisis tends to emerge when things are happening in financial markets that people don't understand, that are obscure. If there were a good set of variables measuring them, they probably would not result in a crisis. So we have quite a few measures of stress in financial markets. The best ones don't go very far back in time. And furthermore, the effects, financial variables are clearly related to standard macroeconomic variables like real activity, but most of the time this relationship is weak, and there are occasional episodes in which it's strong. And what we need to do is to find our models that capture this episodic nature of the connection and can determine the nature of the connection when it's important. But there's not much data in these periods when financial variables become important. Their crises are by definition rare, So it's not the length of the time series we have, it's how many periods when we actually get real financial crises. So if we're looking just at US data, as I'm going to be in this talk, we're inevitably going to be using Bayesian methods. That is, we're going to be needing to combine prior information with what the data tells us, because the data doesn't have a whole lot to tell us about. We don't have very many episodes to look at. What's going on in the theoretical literature now, people who built the DSGEs that are being used in central banks are very busy making sure that they have financial frictions in them now. Theorists are very busy trying to construct models where financial frictions can have large real effects. Ideally, models in which they not only can have large real effects, but where most of the time they don't, and every once in a while you get a crisis. But the theoretical models are, I think of them as a lot like the price stickiness in pre-2008 DSGEs. The Calvo pricing story, which nobody really believed. It was called a micro foundation. It's still called a micro foundation for price stickiness. But it's only a micro foundation in the sense that it's a story in which they're optimizing agents, but everybody realizes nothing like this actually happens in the real world. And the financial frictions in most of the theoretical and calibrated models that are more and more common these days are like this. For example, they set up, they break agents in the economy into one class who knows how to do investments and hence become financial intermediaries, and another class who don't, and those are exogenously specified. And then you talk about what happens if there's some kind of friction in the flow between these two types of agents. But surely the size of the financial sector changes over time, and one of the things we're worried about is what changes the size. And it's an open question exactly what the productive output of the financial sector is. These models take it as exogenously given that the financial sector is absolutely critical to getting efficient allocation of investment, and a lot of people think we're not sure of that. So these stories, there are competing stories in the literature. None of them are actually micro-founded in the sense of being founded in empirical microeconomic studies where you can connect the micro story to observe data on individual banks or financial intermediaries or investors. Just as the New Keynesian Phillips curve is not micro-founded in that sense. But these models that are being produced now are, they are looking for a parsimoniously parameterized theoretical mechanism that will let us discuss how financial collapse can produce big real effects. But unlike the DSGEs, they're not built on top of a consensus description of the probability model for the variables. People who add financial frictions to DSGEs, they generally pick some measure of financial stress and drop it into their model. But there's different people pick different measures of financial stress. And the different measures of financial stress do not all behave in the same way. And there are not a set of reduced form or semi-reduced form facts the way they were as DSGEs developed. The first DSGE model was really the Cristiano Eichenbaum model, which was calibrated and was calibrated to match the impulse responses from structural VARs. And the subsequent literature, much of which began to do formal estimation, but it still used the set of frictions that Cristiano and Eichenbaum found they needed to match those structural VAR impulse responses. And those structural, the way I look at DSGEs is their contribution is to give us stories to help convince people that the estimated responses to monetary policy could occur. But people don't really believe those stories, at least not enough to do formal welfare. I don't believe them well enough to do formal welfare analysis with DSGEs. But I think DSGEs are valuable mainly because they are built on the foundation of structural VAR identification of the effects of monetary policy. So they do give a reasonable description of how the economy responds to monetary policy, even if you can question the story about how that happens. But furthermore, as we start thinking about, could we build a foundation of reduced form statistical modeling of the joint behavior of financial and real variables that's analogous to the structural VAR literature, you realize that these phenomena are not linear, so linear vector order regressions aren't going to do. We need at least time-varying volatility and probably other forms of nonlinearity and non-Gaussianity. Reduced form time series modeling. This is really time series modeling of the joint distribution of time series where you recognize that they might not be Gaussian, they might not be linear, they might have time-varying variances. There's no packaged program that does this for the average applied macroeconometrician, and there won't be for a while. One reason that my work on this is going so slow is that I'm writing the code from scratch as I go along, and it'll be a few years before not only before we have code, but before we agree on exactly which kinds of nonlinearity and non-Gaussianity and time-varying volatility we need. So it's not just the code isn't there. Nobody's standard econometrics courses are teaching people how to use this stuff yet. So this paper attempts to make some progress in the direction of weakly structured modeling the joint behavior of financial and macroeconomic time series. It assembles a short list of macroeconomic and financial stress variables. There's a filter on the financial stress variables in that I wanted them to be available over a fairly long span of time, at least back to the 1970s. The paper estimates a structural Bayesian vector order regression with time-varying covariance matrices. And as I'll explain later, the identification comes purely off the time-varying variances. That may be a mystery how that can happen, but I'll show you as we go along. And the questions there's a lot of questions you could ask with this model that I haven't explored yet, but what I will be showing you is evidence on whether using data through 2007 and this framework would have told us that the financial stress variables were useful for predicting the other variables. And a separate question, so that's the question of if we stopped in 2007 and asked, just looked, would it have been a good idea to have the financial variables in just to understand what was going on up to 2007? The answer is yes. And people could have seen that. Some people did see that, I guess, at the time, but the standard models didn't include them. The effects weren't strong enough to convince people to include these variables. And then I look at whether the model that I estimate through 2007 would have helped in forecasting or anticipating the Great Recession. And the answer there is not a whole lot. What I haven't yet done a comparison of the model with the financial variables to a model without financial variables. I think a model without financial variables will look worse than what I'll show you for this model. And I think that it would have gone on projecting growth a little bit longer. But this model doesn't anticipate the crisis in any important sense. So this is what some of the time series look like. The top line is GDP growth. And you can see it varies between about -3% and plus 1.5%. The second line is the commercial paper spread, the difference between, I think it's 6 months, I'm not, maybe 3 months commercial paper and 3 months treasury bill rate. And the bottom line is the only part of the senior loan officer survey that the Federal Reserve sends out regularly.
Could you just say the time, because you cannot read this?
Yeah, I will in just a minute. The senior loan officer survey that the Fed does regularly, which asks senior loan officers at banks questions about their policies on lending. This is their policy on consumer loans. When it goes up, when it's high, senior loan officers are saying, most senior loan officers are saying they're tightening standards. When it's low, they're saying they loosen it. The time period is 1970 through 2011. Now that let's see, we have the challenge here is this for commercial paper spread. You can see there are episodes where it moves a lot. There are spikes, but then there are long periods where nothing much happens. And the same is true for senior loan officer survey data. The period from about here to here, there's nothing interesting happening. It's all small movements. But there are these huge movements back in the 70s, and again, a big set of movements out here. This is why a standard linear VAR with constant variances is not going to work. I haven't done anything about we really ought to recognize that this commercial paper spread is always positive. It could actually, in principle, go negative, but it's never gone negative, and so the model ought to take that into account. What I'm going to do is use a linear vector order regression that lets the variances of the variance covariance matrix of the variables vary through time. So here's the model. It's a standard structural vector order regression. This is a matrix polynomial in the lag operators. The dates that I use are the data run from 1970 through 2011 third quarter, and though the first part of that is lost because there are 6 lags in the system. A of L doesn't vary through time. The diagonal of A naught is all constrained to be 1. The shocks, epsilon, are normal and uncorrelated with each other. So their covariance matrix is diagonal, but that covariance matrix changes with time. Now, one approach here would be to take this model and do a hidden Markov chain state switching approach, which is what Tao Jia and I did in an AER paper in 2006. But I decided that at this stage, what I'd like to do, because I'm going to do this identification business, I would just specify the breaks. So because in what I'll report today, I'm just using data up through the end of 2007, the breaks occur at the end of 1979 and the beginning of 1983. So we're separating pre-Volcker and post-1983. The Volcker reserve targeting episode in the US was about 1979 through 1983. He deliberately told people that the Fed was no longer trying to smooth interest rates. Interest rates became very volatile. But that policy, without being explicitly thrown away, actually disappeared by the end of 82. And interest rates started to be smooth again. So we know where these breaks occurred. There's not really that much point in trying to get the data to tell us, give us this same set of breaks. So I just specified that exogenously. Now, if any of you have done structural VAR estimation or have read papers on it, you know that the usual approach is to recognize that a structural VAR like this, if we don't put any restrictions on A of L and just say epsilon is diagonal, the model's not identified if everything is constant through time, if the lambda was constant. But it turns out that if lambda is not constant, there is a sense in which the model is identified. So long as every element of the lambda vector changes, that is, so long as each independent source of variation in the economy is more volatile at some times than others, then it's possible to figure out the A matrix, which tells us how the various shocks affect the economy. We can find out what the A matrix is without further restrictions. Here's a little intuition as to why this can work. If we estimated a reduced form vector autoregression, where we just predicted the y's from past y's, and looked at the error matrix from that, there'd be a covariance matrix, which I'll call sigma t. Each of those, there's 6 variables, so each of those matrices is 6 by 6, but there's only 21 free parameters because it's symmetric. So each of the sigma t's, and we're going to have 3 periods, so there are 3 sigma t's, each of which has 21 free parameters. There are 3 of them, so there's 63 of these sample covariance matrices of 1 step ahead forecast errors to look at. A and the 3 lambda t's, which are the parameters that we're using to try to fit sigma t, there's 36 parameters in A, 6 diagonals that are constrained to be 1, and then 3 length 6 lambda t vectors. So that's 48 free parameters. So we have more data points than parameters. We can expect we may get identification. Now this is only a partial identification because it just breaks up the variation into independent sources. And to actually think about what these independent sources are, we have to look at their effects on the economy and ask, do they look like anything we recognize? So how am I going to estimate this? For a fixed A0, and we are going to keep fixed, for a fixed value of A0 and given values for the lambda t vectors, we can evaluate the posterior density. This is the likelihood modified by a prior, and we can evaluate that with the common filter. There are a lot of free parameters in this model other than A0 and lambda, but if we hold A0 and lambda fixed, we know how to get the value of the likelihood, the maximized value of the likelihood for all the other parameters with the common filter. So then we have a nonlinear optimization problem, but not over all the parameters of the vector autoregression, and there are hundreds and hundreds of those. We have just 48 free parameters in A0 and lambda t. And so it takes about 40 seconds per iteration of an optimization program. And on my laptop, when I'm home, it goes 4 times faster. but last night it was taking 40 seconds per iteration. And the individual likelihood evaluations take less than a second. This takes so long because you have to do numerical differentiation with respect to 48 parameters. So there are at least 48 likelihood evaluations on each iteration. So it should be possible to get standard errors on error bands on what comes out on the impulse responses and so on. I haven't done that yet. Now this is a plot of impulse responses that's meant to convince you that the identification sort of works. I looked through at the responses to all these independent sources of shocks, and lo and behold, one of them looks just about exactly like what everybody estimates as the response to a monetary policy shock using other methods. This is, the upper left is the response to the first of these 6 structural shocks. There are 6 independent structural shocks. This is the first one. I looked through all of them to see if any of them looked like anything I recognized. This is the only one I recognize. This is industrial production. You can't read the axes, but this is 0 here. So there's a slight positive response initially, but it's overall negative and non-trivial. It's going down, I think, is that 1.3? It's going down, I think, 30 basis points. This is inflation. There's a little bit of what's called in the structural VAR literature a price puzzle. Initially, prices go up, but then they go down substantially. And this is the Treasury bill rate, short Treasury bill rate, which jumps up by 50 basis points. And that's all looks like what we expect to go with monetary policy tightening shock. Now the interesting, if you didn't use the financial variables, I don't think this way of trying to get identification would work. What's going on here is that this monetary policy, this standard set of monetary policy shocks, goes with a sharp rise in the spread between commercial paper and Treasury bills. Now there's a paradox here which I still don't understand. This is a temporary substantial fall in the proportion of senior loan officers reporting tightening standards for consumer loans. So I don't understand exactly why that should go with the rise in the commercial paper spread. But this, except for this frame, this shock looks like what we'd expect from a monetary policy shock. Also, this is the spread between the long rate and the short rate, and it initially goes down substantially, which means the yield curve is flattening out or going inverted, which is again something we associate with a monetary policy contraction. This is just to show you the nature of the time variation. Each column is one of these periods within which lambda is constant, and each column is a lambda vector. It's hard to interpret it because these are not the variances of variables, they're the variances of these structural shocks. And the point here is just to show you that there are substantial differences. For example, here, the fifth shock, these are standard errors. It more than doubles, increases by 1.5 times. This period 2 is the Volcker disinflation, and most of the variables are quite a bit more variable in that period than in the other periods. These are the impacts of the shocks. The first shock is the one that I think we have an interpretation for. And this is what makes me think that the financial variables are important for identifying this shock. Treasury bills go up, commercial paper spread goes up by a similar order of magnitude. If we go across the other shocks, either there's not much movement or they're not similar orders of magnitude. or their opposite sign on here. This is the only one that moves the spread and the bill rate by substantial amount and similar amounts. And it has a very big effect on this commercial loan tightening variable that's got a paradoxical sign. So there is some evidence that there's predictive value for these variables. The evidence I'll give you is not what I'd ideally like to give you Markov chain Monte Carlo evaluations of the likelihood, of the integral of the likelihood, but I haven't had time to do that yet. So I'm saying let's look at whether the spread variables, the financial variables numbered 4 to 6, don't enter the equations determining the first 3 variables. With all 6 lags in the model, this hypothesis is not rejected, but almost no restrictions are rejected if you leave all 6 variable lags in. This model really doesn't need 6 lags. So instead I constrained the 5th and 6th lag to be 0 and then recalculated this restriction, and you get a chi-squared statistic that's almost double the degrees of freedom. It's in the, because it's such a big number of degrees of freedom, it's in the far tail of the distribution. Pretty strong evidence, though it doesn't meet the Schwartz criterion. If you do the reverse and ask, could we exclude the standard macro variables from the financial variable equations, you get a much smaller chi-square statistic. It's still significant but this is not a conventional frequentist test. But it's much less far out in the tail, and it's not close to meeting the Akaike criterion of being double the degrees of freedom. So that's the evidence I have that these variables, and I also did some experiments just to ask, well, what about the hypothesis that interest rates affect output and inflation? And the chi-square statistics are very similar. So the strength of evidence for these financial variables affecting output and inflation is very similar to the evidence that our standard monetary policy variables belong in the system. Now, would this have helped us forecast the crisis? But what we've looked at so far says if we had been unbiased in our assessment of evidence, we probably should have been putting financial variables into our models before 2007. There was evidence they were important. We didn't have a conceptual framework for how to do that. We had Girdler and Gilchrist. They had a DSGE model with financial variables in them, but it wasn't widely agreed that that was the obvious way to do it, and many other people were working on that, and so the central banks didn't have financial frictions in their policy models. This shows that the statistical evidence was they should have. But would it have helped? Now, not a whole lot. The black line is the actual path of GDP in the crisis, starting in these 4. This is the beginning of 2007, so the forecasts all start off at the end of 2007. I think that without the financial variables, and I should do this, I think that without the financial variables, you still get output shooting off at a higher rate than here. So there's a little help from the financial variables. But you can see the end of 2007, the model forecast was for a slight decline in the growth rate. It actually declined more in the first quarter of 2008. The model still says, well, okay, it'll be a little bit later, but we're going to get back to the same path. Then it declined more in the second and third quarters of 2008. Actually, second, third, and fourth quarters of 2008. The model keeps starting off from where we are now and saying, okay, now it's going to turn around and we're going to go back to growing. And there's a yellow line you can't see. It keeps doing that until we get just about to the bottom. Just before the bottom, it turns up. And then it's still, and then it gets to be too pessimistic. But then when we get to about 2010, it starts tracking the line. Essentially what's going on here is it's looking at rates of growth. When a rate of growth starts being persistent enough, it starts projecting it, at least on the upside. And so once we get to this period where the growth rate of GDP has been steady for almost 2 years, it begins to extrapolate that. So this is not a stellar record of forecasting. It's actually not worse than other models, I think. But it's having the financial variables in the model wouldn't have warned us 6 months ahead of time that we were about to hit a crash, that's for sure. These are price forecasts. They're even more exotic. But that's partly because price behavior was more exotic in this period. The inflation rate tends to be very persistent, and the model catches that, and so up until Lehman, it's just projecting continued inflation at the same rate. Then with Lehman, there's a crash in the price level, negative growth in prices, which for 2 quarters, which is not there in the data in other periods, at least not this magnitude. And it quickly decides that that's going to persist. And so it's forecasting deflation through until about 2010, or just the end of 2009, and then it starts tracking the recent rate of growth. The model is, I have done forecasts from the very end of the sample, and the model is predicting about 2.6% real growth over the next several years and inflation of over 3%. But that's only with data through third quarter of 2011, not with the most current data. So this is compared to other models which also didn't forecast the crash. This is not much worse. I think it will turn out that having the financial variables in there makes this fairly bad performance better than it otherwise would have been. But having financial variables is not in the model is not going to be the solution to predicting the next crash. In fact, I think almost by definition, the next crash like this one will be unpredictable. What we can hope for is to have a model that as we head into a crash and realize where we are, we'll have a reliable story about what is producing the problems and what policy measures might have what effects on the problems. So my conclusion is there was evidence before 2008 that financial stress variables belonged in our models. Having them in the models would have only been of marginal help, if at all, in anticipating the crisis. And financial stress variables help in identifying a monetary policy shock. That last thing leads me to a concluding speculation. It looks as if monetary policy acts by creating financial stress via liquidity restrictions. I think that's an interesting working hypothesis. And if that's true, maybe what a financial crisis is a situation where the financial system endogenously, without a deliberate disturbance from monetary policy, creates roughly the same pattern of effects that a sharp tightening of monetary policy would do. In other words, monetary policy works by drying up liquidity in a moderate way. A financial crisis is a situation where the private financial system drastically shrinks liquidity without the Fed having initiated it directly. That might help us identify what's going on. That working hypothesis might help us identify a useful class of models. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. Let me start by asking a couple of questions. Do you think there is room for modeling a little bit more the financial sector, like in terms of innovation, or derivatives, spending derivative, or shadow banking, that's parallel to monetary policy that could played a role in it?
Yeah, there's certainly lots more that could be done. I think of this as a bare first step. There should be more variables in the model. Some of the things you mentioned are exactly describing data problems rather than data. The shadow banking sector was shadow because we didn't really understand how big it was or what it was doing. We're getting more information in the US about the shadow banking system now, but there's not going to be a long historical time series on shadow banking.
But how about derivatives, for example?
Well, even derivatives. One of the reasons derivatives created problems is there was so much innovation in the creation of types of derivatives and markets that only came into existence a few years before the crisis, whose operations people didn't, even the participants didn't really understand. So this is the big challenge to doing empirical work on this. The financial innovation inherently means that existing data measures may not be capturing the important things that are going on. One thing that we could be trying to do more of is looking at disaggregated panel data. There's a lot of information on individual banks, in some countries at least, and there has been interesting work on how the crisis propagated through the banking system. For macro modeling, what macroeconomists do is learn not to ask questions about where aggregates come from. We have models with capital and labor and output and consumption, but those are all accounting fictions. But they're very useful accounting fictions. And the probability modeling we do usefully ignores the fact that the aggregate data really has incredible amounts of microdata underneath it whose stochastic structure we're not modeling. Now, in the financial area, we have rich sources of data on individual securities, individual banks, individual institutions. We can do micro studies with those data. What would be ideal would be if we could find ways to aggregate or summarize those kinds of data in a way that could bring them into a macro model. Because it's not, these panel data, the panel data is very seldom available currently for long spans of time. We often have studies that over some span of time, or they're sampled at intervals. And so using them directly in a real-time policy model may not be practical. But developing summary measures of financial stress, term mismatch, maturity mismatch, liquidity is something that we might do more of. All the measures that I have here, except for the commercial paper spread, which looks like it's the most important of the variables I used, is a price measure. The senior loan officer survey is a little closer to a quantity measure, but it doesn't actually look at any amounts of trades or balance sheets. And you could imagine trying to go in the direction of getting that kind of information into these models also.
Okay, thank you.
So from the pictures you showed and your interest, looks like there are two issues here. One is you want to have early warnings about crisis. So that would be trying to find a leading indicator, or perhaps using econometric parlance, Granger-Simms causality series that would help predict crisis. That's one issue. And the second is in a normal episode, or even when there is monetary tightening, what happens? So all the variables move the same time endogenously, I guess. So I think it's very hard to find something that would do everything all together. And looking at your plots, like you mentioned before, there are episodes that something move, and some episodes that the same variable is just stable. So perhaps using like regime models would help, because that's exactly when movement comes on.
Yes, in this paper, I deliberately started out not looking at changes in the linear structure. That's partly reflecting my experience working with hidden Markov chain regime switching models with Tao Jia, where we found it was very hard to get strong evidence of change in the linear structure, but very easy to get strong evidence of change in the variance-covariance matrix of disturbances. Also, back to my first identified VAR paper, though it wasn't, I didn't realize it was that at the time, a paper called, can't remember, it's an AER proceedings paper where I did a VAR and just tried different rotations of the covariance matrix, looking for where I got consistent impulse responses in the Great Depression and in the post-Great Depression, in the post-war period. There I discovered the impulse responses, if you rotated the shocks right, were very similar in the Great Depression and in the post-World War II era in the US. The huge difference in the two periods was in where the shocks were originating. And I think as a first order thing, the big difference between eras or periods in the macroeconomy is that the origin of disturbances changes from one period to another. That doesn't mean I don't think there's any changes in the linear structure, but as you saw here, it was very hard for me to reject. I was getting borderline rejections of rather strong restrictions on the linear structure. And that's because linear structure is much harder to identify than covariance matrices of disturbances. Nonetheless, I think it would be a good idea, especially if I think it would be interesting in using the data that goes beyond 2007 to see whether things change so much then, there might be evidence of a real change in the linear structure post-2008.
That was João Vitor but from now on, please identify yourself before asking.
Ricardo Cavalcanti, FGV. We have many students here today, and perhaps you could suggest ways for their future work that would prevent them from working on models like the sticky price ones that we really don't believe in them. How can we do financial friction models without getting into that trap?
I actually, the question is, what do you mean by not believing in them? I believe prices are sticky. I just don't believe I know exactly why. So if you're doing policy, what policymakers use these models for is as guides to what the effects of policy changes would be. And then they use their own weighting scheme to decide how they like inflation, more or less inflation versus more or less unemployment. There's no central bank I know of that actually does policy by maximizing the representative agent utility in a DSGE. And if we're going to give a coherent story of how monetary policy works, it's got to involve non-neutrality. So I don't have a strong objection to the attempt to create a simple non-neutrality story that's in the DSGEs. If somebody can think of a similarly simple and only semi-convincing story about financial frictions that matches the data, I don't think that's a bad research agenda. You have to be ready to be criticized, but you don't have to. Any macro model of financial frictions is going to be a horrific simplification, just as any macro model of price stickiness is. And I don't think it's a bad thing for macroeconomists to look for well-chosen simplifications. We should always recognize the criticisms. Like with the new Keynesian-Phillips curve, we know that most of the stories that justify that are stories where we think that a systematic policy change, changing the long-run inflation rate, would change those stories. If it's contract lengths change systematically with the inflation rate. If it's the frequency with which the Calvo ferry comes and lets you change your price, you know that that would change if there were a big change in the inflation rate. So you don't want to use those models to do evaluation of drastic permanent changes in policy. But you need some form of non-neutrality to understand how monetary policy changes flow through the economy. And if you're going to criticize the Calvo model, you've got to come up with some other model that works to do the same thing. And on these financial frictions, we're still in a position of having much more uncertainty about what's a reasonable, simple story and there may even be none about why financial frictions matter. So I think students shouldn't be afraid of bold simplifications. Just because they aren't exactly true doesn't mean they might not be useful.
Let me just continue this question a little bit. But what do you think about this collateral model of Janet Corpus or Kiyotaki-Moore? And do you think they are sort of presenting already something more reasonable?
That's an example of, and there's a similar work by Hay and Krishnamurti and somewhat similar work by Brunnermeier-Sanikoff. These differ in the degree to which they try to be realistically calibrated and the degree to which they try to be sophisticated about how optimizing agents might end up creating a bad equilibrium. A common theme, though, is this one that I mentioned, which is they tend to divide the economy into agents who know how to invest and agents who don't, and that's given exogenously. And I think of that working assumption as similar to the Calvo ferry or a fixed contract length. It's surely not true that the world is divided into those who know how to invest and those who don't. But you do need some way to explain why financial intermediation actually has real effects, and that's one proposed story. I think if you're going to do welfare analysis of policy, you'd want to be very careful of doing it in those models because they don't have an endogenous explanation of the size of the financial sector or of why it's useful or dangerous. They model some of the dangers, but they don't. And they model the usefulness, but in those models, the financial sector is useful because it's just from the beginning assumed to be necessary and useful. And that ought to still be an open question.
Marty Eichenbaum. Chris, I just had a question. This is incredibly ambitious in the sense of trying to use the model to predict when the crisis will occur, in some sense. There's an analogy to the currency crisis literature, which is to say it's kind of very difficult to predict in real time when a crisis will occur, but certain institutions or states of the economy are instructive about the notion that a crisis will occur at some point. And I was wondering if you had thought about, in some sense, that less ambitious agenda, but what may be more useful in the end.
Well, to translate that into something you would actually use in real time, you would be saying the probability of a crisis state shifts, even though maybe nothing is happening that looks like a crisis right now. And there are people who are putting together models like that. I don't think is less ambitious. It's in a way more ambitious. Here I was just shooting for the possibility that looking at a bunch of extra variables and doing the inference right by taking account of stochastic volatility might give some payoff. But any model that tries to generate time-varying probabilities of crisis is going to be full of a priori judgment, because crises are so rare and we don't have any standard empirical relationships that are really reliable.
Well, I take that, I mean, it's interesting because I presume macroprudential regulation, when you say, you know, when, not you, but when we say we want the state to look like this, we're implicitly saying we kind of know that certain states are associated with a lower probability over some point of time of a crisis. But I think what you're saying is we don't have a lot of evidence for that.
Well, there's a difference between saying we don't know that every time leverage goes up, there's going to be it makes crisis more likely, and saying that we don't know that increased capital requirements would reduce the likelihood of a crisis. I don't think we really know either one, but it's plausible that one could devise capital requirements that would reduce the likelihood of a systemic financial crisis. As you and I were talking about last night, figuring out how you actually do that is a tremendously hard problem that goes beyond macro modeling. And it's certainly a problem for the attempts to regulate and make the likelihood of a crisis lower, that we don't really have a clear idea of what kinds of measures would make the likelihood of a crisis lower. We have some vague, rough ideas. The same was true in the 30s, and they found some measures that seems to work for 70, 80 years. So we might stumble through ourselves, finding a way to make crisis less likely and not doing too much damage to the economy in the meantime. But I agree it's a very hard problem.
Your question?
Marco Cavalcanti from EPGE. You mentioned that one nice thing about DSG models is their connection to structural VARs. How do you feel about identifying structural VARs based on sign restrictions from DSG models?
It's a little bit incestuous. If the DSGEs had sprung independently from the minds of brilliant economic theorists, and then we used them to identify structural VARs, that would be really nice. But of course, in reality, the structural VARs sprang forth from the minds of empirical macroeconomists, and then DSGEs were built on top of them. So I don't think it will be comforting if sign restrictions based on DSGEs turn out to give similar identification to other approaches. It would be disturbing if it gave you a completely different identification. But I don't think it would be, I wouldn't want to say I trust more identification coming from DSGEs, since the basic parameterization of DSGEs Marty constructed to make them give impulse responses like structural VARs.
Any more questions? Let me ask you, following this question, don't think that's to go to this financial question. It would be much more harder to do, much tougher for VAR model, because you have to get into more regulation and more. There's some other instrument the central bank maybe just not.
Right. This model doesn't have any macroprudential policy levers in it. It looks like we identify something like a monetary policy shock, which would be a standard monetary policy lever, but there's nothing in this reduced form model that I've been able to see as a macroprudential regulatory shock. So that's, and in fact, that's true in quite a few of these theoretical or calibrated models of financial real sector interactions. There's a few models that actually have policy levers, but many of them are just satisfied with showing you how a crisis can occur without actually having any parameter or shock that you could interpret as showing the effects of a policy. That's difficult. You get, one of the nice things about monetary policy loosening and tightening is there's been quite a bit of monetary tightening and loosening historically. So you have a pretty good idea that if only you could figure out the identifying restrictions, you'd get a lot of variation in that to estimate its effects. The kinds of macroprudential regulations we're talking about now don't have a lot of time series variation to use. We can't talk about periods when they've been on and off with frequent changes. So it's going to be tough.
My name is Salim Levy from University Fluminense and APMEC Rio. I would know your view about interest rate policy. If we can do a model like policy monetary, or we are in Brazil economy. I would know if you can help us about this idea. Thank you.
I'm not an expert on the Brazilian economy. I got interviewed by Valor day before yesterday, and we talked this much about the Brazilian economy, and that's the whole story was about the Brazilian economy. The Brazilian economy is the monetary policy, interest rate policy in the U.S. and the U.K. and the Euro area and Japan is very hard because the standard instrument of monetary policy, the interest rate, is totally unavailable because it's already down to zero, and all those countries would like to make it lower if they could. Brazil's got positive interest rates, so the usual approach should work. Now, it's true that in Brazil, I gather, that output growth has recently slowed, and inflation looks like it might be picking up, and that's two opposite signals for monetary policy. So it's the kind of situation where there's always debates about what's the right thing to do. An inflation targeting regime, which in normal times seems to work pretty well, says you don't try to permanently affect the rate of output growth or the rate of unemployment with interest rate policy. You can affect it for 2 or 3 year time spans, but you should not try to use monetary policy to make permanent changes in those things. On the other hand, you ought to be able to control the inflation rate in the long run. So those are the basic principles, but they don't help you very much if output growth is slowing down and inflation is picking up a little bit. You know, at some point, if inflation picks up enough, you may have to be willing to pay a price in terms of higher interest rate and contraction. But exactly when that's a good idea is something I certainly wouldn't want to pass judgment for Brazil right now.
Time for the last question, or? No. Okay.
Is there one?
So going back to your econometric models. Econometric models have a hard time to predict crisis. That's okay.
Predict what?
The crisis.
Yeah.
Economists didn't predict the crisis too. But in your econometric model, it was still predicting recovery, even after a year, even in a year after Lehman Brothers event. So at that time, even my father would say, well, we were in a crisis. So isn't it like too demanding to ask for time series to predict the future, looking to the back in the event of change of regimes? Is that, and connect to that, if we still insist in doing that, shouldn't we put some future markets into the model?
Futures markets might help. It took a while for economists to this is not predicting immediate recovery. As we were going down, it was predicting that the growth rate would turn around, and it took it a while to start predicting that the growth rate would continue to be negative for a while. But I'd need convincing that there were people who weren't just saying we're in a crisis. I mean, output is low enough so even with these forecasts, we were in a crisis. The question was, when were we going to turn around? And one thing you have to look at is previous recessions. The VARs made a big impact in the 80s because at the end of the first or second Reagan recession, Bob Litterman made a forecast that we were at the bottom of a recession. There had been negative output growth. All the commercial forecasters were projecting very low growth. Litterman, using a vector autoregression, said there's a mean reverting property for GDP, and he turned out to be right. And if you looked at mean square errors over the next 20 years, him being right about that one period of very rapid growth gave him a much better mean square error than other forecasters for a long time. So I think we knew we were in a financial crisis. There are a lot of people saying, well, this is just a financial crisis. Knowing that the growth rate was not going to turn around was not so easy, I think. The financial markets put a non-trivial probability on deflation for quite a while into the crisis. So the model's making the center of its forecast deflation is not so bad. And I haven't put any error bands on these. That's one of the problems with showing just point forecast. The error bands on these things probably spread way out very quickly. So you're suggesting that there are other people who would have done much better at forecasting than this record. And I would like, before I was sure of that, I would want to see exactly who it is or what model it is.
No.
I was thinking whether, like the dispute about econometric models, like looking far behind versus looking ahead with economic theory. And in that sense,
looking ahead with economic theory. My view is that economic theory is more backward-looking than econometric models. Economic theory is always explaining the recent history. But we can argue about this some other time.
Okay. Okay, we just thank you very much again, Professor Sim.